Throughout the world, people of faith are the first responders to the suffering of their neighbors. They are faithful servants, ministering to people who bear the ills of our times. It begins at the grassroots level, in the village or the small town. A spirit rises, unites faith with deed, and the world changes. And we bear witness to a force of light that renews hope to the despairing. Around the world, people of faith rely on governmental systems to uphold basic human rights for themselves and their fellow citizens. However, when injustice occurs, the faithful must continually exert a strong ethical influence on the state in support of policies that ensure the dignity of all persons in society. It begins at the grassroots or seats of government, when one person speaks truth to power to build a movement, and the world changes.
I volunteered to serve in the United States Navy as a student because I felt I had an obligation to my country and to those things that I felt were very important. So I went into naval training. I went into naval intelligence, ultimately. I became an intelligence briefer for Admiral Arleigh Burke, who was Chief of Naval Operations, who had the full responsibility of sending ships back and forth around the world or engaging in combat in the Lebanese Straits crisis or Taiwan in those days. I was at his side, watching a man who had to exercise authority at the highest levels. That was both instructive but challenging to my faith. What would I do in similar circumstances? And that always has been the question that I've raised when we come now to this national forum, the United States Senate, and decide on questions of war and peace. Now, better still to decide how better to negotiate with the enemy. Can you reach a settlement that is realistic without getting into armed forces, even if you have the armed forces behind you? Can you think through in the life of the country that you're dealing with how changes could come if there were more food and clothes and opportunities for young people and lots of other things for that? Is there a formula out there? And usually there is. If it's pursued, it may take more time and patience and money. And sometimes people get impatient and they want solutions now. But that's a part of the moral dilemma that I think comes from our faith. If we were not sensitive because of the faith and the creed, these might not be difficult decisions. Now, ultimately, they might come back to haunt us in ways that would be devastating, as our consciences then are filled with why in the world did I do that then and now? And maybe we do that in any event on things that are less consequential. I'm challenged frequently because the controversies that we are debating in the Senate have enormous consequences, not just for Americans, but for people around the world. If we are discussing, should we develop a new weapon system, invest billions of dollars in items that, if they are ever used, are going to kill tens of thousands of people or more, justified by the fact that other nations may have similar systems, and if so, we want ours to be the best, or we want ours to intimidate those who might want to transgress upon us. Now, these get into very difficult moral equations. You can say, as a Methodist, I think I would go back and pray for a while and see, what I find. But even after you've done so, somebody has to make these decisions. You can choose not to be involved in public life and the controversies of that sort and condemn others for being insensitive. But here you are. One of the joys of serving in public life is that you believe you can make a constructive difference, that you really can make a huge change in the lives of other people, and that will be better for all of us and for the earth that God has given us. The other side of the coin is that you have to make decisions, and they are likely to be recorded decisions, not private ones, yes or no, that history will indicate this is where he stood, this is what he said, or he didn't say, or ducked the issue, or wasn't there, and so forth. That's probably an important discipline before God, that you have to stand up and be counted. I've been involved in a worldwide fight against hunger. This involves trade practices. It involves the kinds of seed and fertilizer that might work. It involves especially markets for farmers and their ability really to support themselves and their families. And it really comes to the guardianship of the earth, which is another important part of the Methodist Creed, that God created this earth. We are on it for a period of time to utilize it, to try to serve, to try to grow in our own faith with all the resources that God has given us. But we have an obligation to protect the earth, to protect that heritage for our children and for others that follow after us. I'm deeply concerned about the part of the Methodist Creed that deals with world peace and justice. Peace, first of all, and in this respect, we've been attempting to destroy weapons of mass destruction, to work with Russians, people in Ukraine and Belarus, Kazakhstan. And then as these materials spread, people in Albania and Yugoslavia and elsewhere, it's not that warfare in the past was less brutal, but weapons of mass destruction mean that people can be wiped out as whole societies. So it has been my mission, really informed by the Methodist Creed and this early upbringing, to try to work with other countries systematically to take care of each and every one of these weapons, to destroy them or to guard them or to convert them, so that in fact there is a possibility for some peace and stability. The Methodist Church can be an enormous and powerful source of current information. Each one of us may have gone to school at some point, through secondary school or college or so forth, but and then occasionally we find in reading material something that catches our eye. But a determined pastor and a very strong lay group can really bring us up to speed on what's happening in Kenya and Zimbabwe and what we might be able to do about it. And that's important, that kind of information and practical advice on how to act upon it. And then a strengthening of the will to do so comes from the discipline of regular attendance. The fact that as a congregation, this is not a casual affair for us. This is a very important part and discipline of our lives.
I began as a professional journalist in the mid-1960s. I was in my senior year as a journalist when Ferdinand Marcos, the president at the time, declared martial law on September 21, 1972. I was included in a list of about 10,000 individuals subjected to arrest for being very critical of the Marcos government. My being a critic of the Marcos government had to do both with my role as a journalist, because I've been writing very critical articles, and also because I belong to a youth organization. It is called Patriotic Youth, and it advocated fundamental social, political, economic changes in society, and was instrumental in organizing massive protest actions against Ferdinand Marcos starting in the 1965 up to 1972. When Marcos declared martial law, he declared our organizations illegal. So I was forced to go underground, and I was forced to regroup with a lot of people who had organized a resistance to the Marcos dictatorship until we got involved in the left revolutionary movement. I was one of those who formed what is now known as the National Democratic Front. After a long underground struggle, I was arrested on January 14, 1975, and I was held in military detention for the next 9 years under the Marcos dictatorship until I escaped in 1985. And then the following year, the Marcos dictatorship was overthrown, and I resurfaced and represented the National Democratic Front in a peace negotiations with the new government, which the peace negotiation was sabotaged by the military. Then I had to be forced to go back underground. After 4 years, I was rearrested again and held for 3 more years until I was charged with various crimes of illegal possession of firearms, murder, kidnapping with years illegal detention. I went through investigation and trial before civilian courts until we were finally acquitted of the accusations. So by September 1, 1992, I was freed. And since then, I became one of the leading figures in the human rights movement. It was in 1999 that we organized a political party that participated in the electoral struggle. And I was elected president, and in 2001, elected as a member of Congress and re-elected 2 times more after that in 2007. That brought me to my present status as a senior member of the opposition, being a deputy minority leader in the House of Representatives. Since 2002, they evolved a new counterinsurgency program that worked on this opposition, that those who are organizations that are advocating fundamental changes that seem to reflect the program of the National Democratic Front, which is an underground organization, are deemed part and parcel of the underground movement. And they adopted the policy in order to defeat the underground armed revolutionary movement. They have to wipe out the legal organizations, what they call the legal infrastructure of the underground movement. The government has tolerated the practices of the armed forces and the security agencies of government to accuse us as enemies of the state, in effect rendering us vulnerable to being the object of military attack. That explains why 135 of organizers, members, and territorial leaders of my party, Bayan Muna, have been extrajudicially become victims since 2001 up to the present. Luckily, we have been able to effectively resist and expose the campaign And through the intercession of the churches, including the Methodist churches in the United States, the members of the World Council of Churches, we were able to bring this issue of extrajudicial killing and enforced disappearances to the United Nations, which caused the sending of the UN Special Rapporteur, Philip Alston, in the middle of 2007. And he came out with a very, very incisive report that identified the problem, that in the counterinsurgency plan of the government, extrajudicial killing and enforced disappearances are a component. That's one. The first recommendation is to remove that component from counterinsurgency. But the government up to now has not complied with that. We appeal to the United Methodist Church, to the World Council of Churches, and the other human rights supporters to continue to put pressure on the government to abandon a military solution to the armed conflicts in the Philippines, to seriously pursue the path of negotiated political settlement.
I came to Washington to learn policy. I was Africa Program Officer at Oxfam America, had traveled extensively throughout Africa, probably I would say 28 or 30 of the countries on the continent. Loved the notion that the policy realm, especially Washington-based policy, has greater impact on communities around the world than anything that we were doing on the programmatic end in terms of development. And I wanted to be able to influence those policymakers in Washington, D.C. So I moved to Washington. I worked for the umbrella organization of development organizations, Interaction, for about 4 years to learn how policymaking is done, how advocacy is done, what doors to knock on and how the interagency processes work in terms of the administration, Capitol Hill, how it all gets done, and nuts and bolts and sausage making. And interestingly enough, I liked it and wanted to do more. I had the opportunity to come and be based at a think tank that focused on policy that was really in line with my political leanings and a sense of creating a platform to be able to speak truth to power. And I've been here since. The challenges are many on the continent. I think in terms of U.S. policy, the biggest challenge is getting outside the box, what's often called the Washington Consensus. Structural adjustment policies, neoliberal economics is essentially an economic model where the 1%, using the words of Occupy, right? The 1% continue to get richer and richer at the expense of the majority of people on this planet, the 99%. And U.S. policy reinforces that status quo. So the biggest challenge is getting outside that box, helping people understand that there need to be alternative economic models that put the needs of people first, that don't render people and their communities invisible because of the resources on the land where they happen to live. Clearly, this is not a new phenomenon. The transatlantic slave trade, it was human resources coming from Africa to fuel a global economy. More recently, it's oil, it's gas, it's mining. These essential ingredients for the global economy are increasingly found in Africa. What you see is corporations very much interested in extracting those resources at any cost. And you see really a very heavy hand being played, particularly by the countries where those corporations are housed, whether it's US or Europe. Increasingly, it's many other countries now that have interests at stake in Africa. Clearly, China, India, Brazil are increasing in their significance on the African economic scene and the resource extraction scene. So I think There are many rationales for foreign policy, but often it is the short-term interests dictated by corporate interests and corporate power that end up really undermining opportunities for people, particularly those in resource-rich regions, to be able to actually survive. The hope, the bright spots? Well, I think the bright spots are what you see in places like Tunisia or Egypt. In spite of all the turmoil, you see people who are desperate to find a different political process and a different economic system that meets their needs. Where young people who are the booming demographic on the African continent, right? Young people often college educated, unable to find jobs in spite of huge statistics of economic growth. Africa has 7 of the top 10 growing economies in the world, and yet many young people are left, unfortunately, pushed to the margins. They are finding their voice. So people are organizing, movements are organizing, and we saw it and still see it in Tahrir Square, as complex as that is. I'm also really strengthened that women are expanding their visibility throughout the continent. You have not only in these people's movements that have arisen over the past 2 years, but also you have informal political processes, new opportunities for women's political leadership to emerge throughout the continent. And I think these changes open up new leadership, leadership that is desperately needed on the continent in the 21st century, leadership that's going to put the needs of communities first, of housing, of education, of healthcare, basic essential services that women are often prioritizing throughout the world. And I think this new leadership will continue down a path that puts the needs of the continent first, that puts issues of environmental protection first, and basically saving the continent for future generations and saving the planet. So I see a lot of hope in these political changes that are underway on the continent. These may be new changes, and we have to see what the long-term impacts will be, but they're extraordinary, and it will change the nature of leadership on the continent. And so that gives me a tremendous amount of hope. So I urge people to contact their member of Congress, let them know that they are concerned about issues of militarism and what that means for communities around the world. Why cannot the U.S. take a better stand, take a leadership role in an arms control treaty? It took 10 years of countries fighting to get it to the United Nations, and yet the U.S. has not signed on. The U.S. should have been one of the first to sign on, and people in their church basements can demand through their leadership of Congress that happens, can send letters to the White House demanding that there be an end to the flow, this almost offensive flow of weapons into Africa and other conflict zones must end. On economic issues, clearly U.S. policymakers have a long list of things that they can do. Many of us and many in the faith-based community worked on debt cancellation issues. Debt cancellation is still an issue that's needed today. Liberia had $4 billion in debt, largely buying military weapons from the U.S. $4 billion, a country of 3 million people. It's obscene. Clearly, efforts by ordinary people in the United States to have debt cancellation pushed for Liberia has made a difference, can continue to make a difference in countries that are riddled with debt, not only in Africa, but in other places around the world. So we can play a role. We can demand debt audits. How was the debt incurred? To what extent was it used to buy military hardware? How much of it has actually been repaid many times over? I think we have to be able to use all of these tools to mobilize, to activate, to ignite a passion within people, to not only click the like, but to actually write the letter, read the newspapers, send a letter to the editor, meet with the editorial board of their local newspapers, write a column in their church newsletter, to continue to engage It's not only changing the Facebook profile, but it's figuring out the range of tools that are out there. It's doing training with young people, intergenerational, to help people understand some of the strategies that have worked in the past and what could work now, to also help the older generation understand how to use the technology more effectively, more creatively, to learn from the young people. I think we need these intergenerational spaces, and our congregations can play a role in providing those spaces.
When the social creed speaks of peace, which I embrace, I am a pacifist. I believe that human animals can exist on this planet without killing each other. But as a legislator in a nation that organizes and maintains an army, or a militia, as the Constitution says, every year, I've got to vote on a budget for the Defense Department. I've got to vote to fund the military of the United States of America, the world's only superpower. And so I've got to be honest. That is always the time when I get a lump in my throat when I put my voting card in the back of the seat. Because, I would love to be able to say to the people who vote to send me to Washington to represent them that, look, we don't need an army. But I have to remember as a legislator that when I ran for office, I did not run as a Methodist or a member of the United Methodist clergy. Had I done so, I may or may not have won the seat. But I can have the internal struggle without trying to trespass, in other words, move my narrow theological orthodoxy onto public policy. So I do vote for the defense budget. We all come to Congress with things that are on our inside that we don't necessarily espouse, but they shape and mold us, they direct us. And so when the children's health care bill comes up for a vote, it is my theological background that says, Cleaver, you've got to support this. Now, I don't stand up on the floor and say, well, I'd like to read number 4 in the Methodist Social Principles. I don't do that. But there's no question about it, make no mistake. Those things are influencing me secondarily, and I think primarily I'm influenced by the Gospels. But I don't have to stand around and say that. I don't have to go around and try to, as Jesus said, stand on the street corners and pray so that men will hear my prayers and become pharisaical, and I think we've had too much of that here in Congress. And I think now people are going to go to the corner or go into their closets and pray to their Father who is in heaven. I'd rather get my reward later, as Jesus says, than get the praise of people who say, boy, Cleveland's really religious. You see him standing over there by the voting machine praying. We've come to a very meek moment. At least we've had a meek moment over the last 15 years or so in the church. We've been overpowered by the televangelists and the radio preachers, and we've become intimidated and silent. And if you look back in the history, that's what we've done over the past 25 years or so is antithetical to what John Wesley did and the great preachers of our tradition. But to some degree, because we do have a Washington office, it provides us with a chance to provide guidance for the church. The church must be the the headlights rather than the tail light. And I think we've been the tail light much too often. But the fact that we have an office right next door to the United States Supreme Court and right across the street from the House of Representatives provides us, I think, with a unique opportunity to disseminate information around the country about the major issues coming up before us. And people in the church need to, first of all, be registered to vote. I think if Moses redid the Ten Commandments, it would say, thou shalt not place oneself in a politically impotent position, meaning that we must vote. And because I think it is a sin not to vote, because it means that one has extricated him or herself from the realities going around them. There are some positions that are clearly theological that we've got to address. I even think, for example, Social Security is a theological issue. I mean, we as believers must make sure that people are able to enjoy their sunset years. Contrary to the worship of youthfulness today in the Bible, the elders were the ones who had the wisdom and the ones that received the love and appreciation. And Jesus, on more than one occasion, commanded that we take care of the widows. You know, the most beautiful part of our social principles and creed is that it ends by saying that we believe that God and His will are going to eventually triumph. We believe that God's will be done. We know that ultimately we're going to have peace. We know that ultimately war will be eliminated. We know that ultimately we're going to have a nation where children are protected. And we know that ultimately we're going to have a world where people are not battered and beaten and bludgeoned because of their skin color. We know that. And the only question is what role we will play.
Those who participated in the War of Liberation had certain expectations. They expected to be free. They expected to have freedom of expression, freedom of association. They even expected to be living in plenty. Those that were not employed before the war and thought that their lack of employment had something to do with colonialism, expected to be employed and to have very good jobs and to earn at least a good living. But those expectations only remained dreams. Then we have those who were born after independence. They don't even understand what we mean when we say we fought for this country. And some of them are even asking us, what were you fighting for if what you had before is even far much better than what we now see? And there is a famous statement now that, you know, if really makasunungura nyika, and I mo isungirira pe makaitora tende ko isunungura. In other words, the Shona word to liberate is to untie. It can be translated literally to mean to untie. If this country was tied up somewhere, go and tie it up so that we can go also and untie it from where you took it from. Because they don't really understand what we fought for because of what is now happening at the moment. There's no freedom of expression. There's no freedom of association. I know the politicians in Zimbabwe, for example, only know of two parties. It's either you are MDC or you are ZANU-PF. There's nothing in between. You're not free to even say I'm not MDC. You're not even free to say I'm not ZANU. So there is a lot of dissatisfaction going on.
The inclusive government is called for national healing, forgiveness of sins, forgiveness of crimes. In peace lingo, we call it transitional justice. So this is a period during which Zimbabweans can come to terms with their past, where past atrocities are addressed and the people chart the way forward. And so my appeal is still in that same line, because there is so much to do in Zimbabwe as regards national healing. People do not really understand the magnitude to which we had degenerated as communities. We had gone far, far below, and there is so much work to be done, right? There's people who do not even know what a constitution is, and yet the government has already engaged the people to, facilitate the exercise. Imagine the amount of civic education that needs to be done. The national healing itself is mired in so much controversy. Some people want to follow the government draft. There is the NCA draft led by Love Momaduku. There are several other people with their own documents. All these are issues that need to be addressed and harmonized.
When you look at what has happened over the past 10 years, even going back to pre-independence, post-independence era, where we had violence and people being beaten and killed, the church should play a very important role in trying to heal those wounds. It's not going to be easy, because something that has happened for a long time, and the scars that people have are very difficult to heal. But the church can play a role in trying to bridge the gap between the political parties, because Zimbabwe at the moment is very polarized. It should also play a very important role in mediation between the political parties that are involved in the conflict, starting from the grassroots level up to the national level. When we talk of the politicians, the business people, the academia, they belong to churches. Therefore, it is the duty of the church to sort of conscientize them on their responsibility to society, because their Christianity should not end on Sunday after Mass or after church service, but should go on 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Even if they go to politics, they're in business, whatever they're doing, their Christian principles should take precedence above everything else. Therefore, I think that the church is a very important role to play in society.
It's like the old parable of the man with the coat. The sun and the wind are trying to get the coat off, and the harder the wind blows to get the coat off, the more he pulls it tight around him. And it's only when the sun comes out that he voluntarily takes it off. And we kind of feel as if we've moved from a windy situation now to a sunnier situation. And perhaps we've now also reached a point where even Mugabe himself is more willing to consider alternatives. The country was reaching a point where it was crashing so badly, it could not be sustained that way anymore. I think there is still a hardcore group of people there who do not feel that they have a future in Zimbabwe if things change. And those are the people that I think the church should be most concerned about at the moment. And they're not only at the top, they're in all of our communities. There are the few who have been perpetrators of the old way of approach, who have come forward and said, we want to seek forgiveness. We know we have done wrong. We will do whatever it needs to take. But there are others who have said, yes, we want to belong to this new, happy, smiley atmosphere, but we want to come in through the back door and just sit with you guys, and we hope you won't notice that we are the ones that beat you up. We're focusing on these now to say, to be in real fellowship, this is what we need to go through. We're having to decide, what do you do with people who are multiple killers, who are responsible, who really should end up in The Hague? How do you accompany people to The Hague and do it in a way that they know that this is their calling? That's a tough thing to do. First of all, you have your own fears of these people. And secondly, you know that you're taking them to a place they don't want to be. But how do you bring justice into that reconciliation? We've agreed in our class that we are not going to preach any more sermons on reconciliation until we fully understand how difficult the process is. We're not going to preach any more sermons on forgiveness until we've really felt how painful it is to have to ask for forgiveness and to have to give forgiveness. And then we'll be qualified enough to preach about it. And I think if the church doesn't take up this space at the moment, we could be in for much more difficult times ahead.
We have to look back in our history again. We have seen this before in the Congo. We have seen this before in Malawi, and it all came to an end. In other words, what I'm saying is there will be a post-Mugabe era. The only question is, what is it going to be like? Will it leave us in a mess? Will it bring people together once more? It's very difficult to know. It's very difficult to know. Many people would wish there would be change, but at the same time, people are afraid of that change. What is going to happen in that change?
When government had purchased those arms from China, the timing was very suspicious because the arms were arriving just after the 29th March elections, which were the first elections that Mugabe and the ZANU-PF government lost. So the suspicion is, the idea was, when we lose the election, then we have kind of a military intervention to try and stop the new government to take over. When the arms arrived, so they were coming through South Africa. And now when the message came that the government had imported arms, in the process, that's when the workers, like the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, the churches, and other organizations, they lobbied with the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU. And then COSATU catch up and say, these weapons that are now going to Zimbabwe, what it means is they are going to be used to kill the workers, they are going to be used to suppress the workers, they are going to be used against the Zimbabwean people, they are going to be used to suppress the will of the people. And then that's when the decision was made that no worker is going to offload the ship. And the workers in South Africa say, we are not going to offload the ship. If the ship is going to be offloaded, then the government have to do it. I think they actually used, then Mbeki have to do it himself, to offload the ship. No worker is going. So they stood by that. They stood their ground, and the ship could not be offloaded. And then they tried to change the ship to go to Beira, to Mozambique, so that it would be offloaded in Mozambique. But still the workers in Mozambique were lobbied by COSATU and Zimbabwean workers and say, once these weapons are offloaded, then what it means is they're going to be used against the people, against the other workers. And the workers in Mozambique said, no, we are not going to offload the ship. And then they changed the ship to Luanda. And now in Luanda, also the workers stood their ground. But this is the time now the government of Zimbabwe was trying to work out to change the paperwork, so that Malawi was saying they would wanted to change the paperwork so that the weapons will appear like they were purchased by Malawi, and then they will be airlifted into Zimbabwe. But then the trade unions continued lobbying against that, and then the ship could not be offloaded. And that's when the Germans intervened. And there was a debt between the Germans and the Chinese, and now they wanted to confiscate the weapons and say as part of payment. And that's when the ship was called back, and then the ship went back to China. But the lessons we have always talked about this, when we talk about this, the point is, when we have problems, then we tend to look around and say, whom do we blame for our problem? Is it Britain? Is it America? Is it Germany? Is it France? Someone to blame. But the point that this ship that was made because of this ship is, that means there are points when Africa can stand and make an analysis of ourselves and say, how can we be our own defenders? How can we develop our own nations? How can we begin to think positively and act positively? And this is one example where people have to say no to the killings, no to the suffering of the African people. We are not going to assist any regime. We are not going to assist any government. We are not going to assist any system to oppress its own people. We are going to be our own liberators, and we are going to hold our leaders accountable for what they do. If they do something and we don't agree with it, then we stop it. So if Africa begins to move towards that direction, where we think about ourselves as a people, where we think about ourselves as Africans and say, what can we do to develop positive governance and keep leadership accountable, then most of these problems in Africa will be resolved somehow within the African continent.
The Methodist Church can be an enormous and powerful source of current information. A determined pastor and a very strong lay group can really bring us up to speed on what's happening in Kenya and Zimbabwe and what we might be able to do about it. And that's important, that kind of information and practical advice on how to act upon it. And then a strengthening of the will to do so comes from the discipline of regular attendance. The fact that as a congregation, this is not a casual affair for us. This is a very important part and discipline of our lives. Now, this is pretty heavy stuff for many people. The thought that the Methodist Church ought to be a postgraduate course, Sunday after Sunday or Friday night or whenever we come together. But if we're serious about the world, most people really find this to be pretty exciting. I can recall at my church, St. Lucia United Methodist Church, how interesting it has been to have missionaries and doctors from the field coming back from Africa, talking about their experiences, why they went to begin with, why they're going back, why some of us should go over and help them, or at least to have some idea what this is all about. If we are people in business or the professions or politics that might make a difference with regard to all of this. This is a period of extraordinary stress. Therefore, it really is a time to bring forward God's Word, which is always one of hope, of victory, if we persevere. In other words, we need that sense of optimism at this particular point in a very big way. Not false optimism, but optimism based upon the human condition that God has given us and the possibilities that God has given us. And that seems to me especially important to both discover and to celebrate at this time.
I believe that the United Methodist Church is simply a social group coming together for a weekly meeting without the social creed. The social creed gives direction to Christians who call themselves Methodist after the benediction. It's very easy to be a very powerful Christian between 11 and 12 o'clock on Sundays. But the social creed nags and gnaws and pulls and grabs us to put into practice what we believe in the church and what we believe to be a vital part of the earthly ministry of Jesus the Christ, which is to respond to those who are hurting, to promote racial and ethnic compatibility in society. I mean, we've got to always remember that Jesus did go through Samaria, and the gospel writers made sure that they emphasized the fact that he went through Samaria, a sometimes hostile place for Jews. So I think that the social creed, for me, and hopefully for other Methodists who are familiar with it, and those who will become familiar with it, will become the inspiration for what we must do in our daily lives.
A just political community means citizens are free to choose their leaders without fear, and leaders can vote their conscience. It means the marginalized of society are represented in government, while restorative justice is defended. And we are all transformed when we stand with others and become agents of healing and systemic change.